In 1918 Spain, the air was toxic enough to kill you. And if you time traveled to 16th century America, you'd be lucky not to be burned at the stake. Time travel sounds amazing, in theory, but there are some places you'd have to avoid, like the plague, no pun intended. From volcanic eruptions to violent revolutions, I'm Mike with List 25, and today I'm counting down 25 of the worst places in history to time travel to. If your time machine drops you off in Salem, Massachusetts, or really anywhere in Europe between 1560 and 1630, you're not walking away without a mob accusing you of witchcraft. And no, you don't have to actually do anything witchy. A weird hat, the wrong accent, or just not fitting in could get you killed. In Europe specifically, tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were executed during the witch trial craze. The charges were usually vague, and the trials were more about fear, control, and good old-fashioned scapegoating than anything else. Punishments? Pick your nightmare. Burned alive, drowned, crushed under rocks, or even beheaded. In fact, the Holy Roman Empire made burning mandatory by law, so maybe skip this era completely. Now, if you thought what happened to Pompeii in 79 was brutal, its sister city, Herculaneum, got it even worse. It was closer to the volcano, hit harder, and the outcome was far deadlier. Should you arrive there on that day, you'd be blasted with volcanic ash at nearly 900 degrees Fahrenheit, which means instant death. In some cases, the heat was so extreme that it caused people's bodily fluids to vaporize. That built up pressure inside their bodies, and in some cases, it actually cracked some of the victims' skulls. Those who didn't die from the heat were buried alive in layers of burning ash. And just to put it into perspective, Pompeii was buried under about 9 feet of ash. Herculaneum, 75 feet. That's also why most of it's still buried today. We've only uncovered about 25% of the city. Moving from fire to flood, if you've never heard about the 1931 Central China floods, let me tell you, they were catastrophic. During the summer of that year, after months of non-stop rain, the Yangtze and Huai rivers burst their banks and flooded an area the size of England. Whole provinces were turned into massive, muddy lakes. If you showed up, say, in a city like Wuhan, you'd see that boats had taken over where buses used to run. But the real devastation hit the countryside. One particularly terrifying evening, the dike at Gaoyou broke, and almost 200,000 people lost their lives in a single night. Over the next few months, close to 4 million people died, not just from drowning, but starvation, disease, and the complete collapse of anything that could have helped. Alright, jumping back a few centuries. If you went to the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in the early 1520s, you'd step straight into the outbreak that helped topple an empire. When the Europeans arrived in the Americas, they triggered one of the deadliest biological disasters in human history. You see, unbeknownst to them, they had brought with them smallpox, along with measles, influenza, and a few other old-world diseases, and the local population had no immunity to any of it. In just one wave, smallpox alone wiped out somewhere between 30 and 50% of the Aztec people. Even the emperor, Cuitlahuac, caught it and died after just 80 days on the throne. The Spanish later reported stepping over bodies in the streets, while others described collapsing homes on top of the dead, turning houses into tombs. Up to 90% of the indigenous population across the Americas eventually died from these diseases. It changed the continent forever. Alternatively, you could land on Krakatoa in 1883, but only if you want front row seats to the loudest eruption in history. On August 27th, the volcano exploded with so much force that it was heard over 3,000 miles away. If you were anywhere near the eruption, the sound alone could rupture your eardrums or knock you out cold, assuming you weren't already vaporized by the initial blast, which launched 5 cubic miles of earth straight into the sky. The sea around the island literally boiled, and the pyroclastic flows, those fast-moving clouds of superheated gas and rock, raced over the water and killed thousands. Then came the tsunamis. 165 villages in Java and Sumatra were wiped out, and over 30,000 people died in minutes. Even ships far out at sea were coated in hot ash. 2/3 of the island vanished, and sunsets turned blood red around the world for months. On the other hand, if you time traveled to 1918, the danger wouldn't have come from a volcano, but from the air you breathed. If you ended up somewhere in Philadelphia in October 1918, you'd arrive just after a big public parade that turned the city into a death zone. Within a week, 45,000 Philadelphians were infected. Hospitals were overflowing, undertakers ran out of coffins, and bodies ended up being stacked like firewood in the morgue. Unlike regular flu, this one went after healthy young adults. The worst part was that victims could go from feeling fine at breakfast to dead by nightfall. In places like Western Samoa, 20% of the population died in just a few weeks. In India, up to 20 million people died. Globally, it killed between 50 and 100 million people, which is more than World War I, including about 230,000 in the US alone. I should probably also cover the ages most of us never think about, like the last ice age, 12,000 years ago. Even though we'd started dominating by then, life was by no means easy. We were in a constant fight for survival. I mean, one bad day could basically wipe out your entire family. Granted, it's not like every part of the planet was frozen solid, but the parts that weren't had their own problems. Global rainfall was cut in half, and huge areas that were once lush and green turned into harsh deserts. Food was scarce. If you didn't find something to hunt or forage, you didn't eat. And if you did go after something big, like a mammoth, there was a decent chance you'd end up as the one not walking away. And don't even think about injuries. They had no medicine, no hospitals. In fact, they weren't even farming. It was cold, cruel, and unforgiving. Only a few regions, like Southern Europe, gave humans any real chance of making it through. Of course, freezing to death while hunting mammoths might still be better than showing up in Stalin's USSR. Arriving in the 30s USSR brings you right into the Great Purge, a paranoid crackdown where saying the wrong thing, or nothing at all, could get you arrested, executed, or sent to Siberia. 1 million people were killed in just 2 years. Millions more were packed into the Gulag, a network of brutal labor camps where cold, starvation, and exhaustion did the rest. A bad joke, a missed slogan, even looking unsure could get you a bullet or a train ticket to Kolyama, where winter temperatures dropped to negative 50 degrees Celsius and prisoners had to mine with their bare hands. Not that things were going much better in medieval Europe. The Black Death hit in 1347, and over the next 4 years, wiped out up to half of the continent's population. This disease was the stuff of nightmares. Victims developed egg-sized black swellings that oozed pus and blood. Fever spiked, people vomited blood, and most were dead within a day. The plague spread like wildfire, mostly thanks to fleas hitching rides on rats, but no one really understood how it worked. People were so terrified they thought just being near someone sick or even looking at them could get you infected. Approximately 25 million Europeans died. So yeah, if you time travel here, there's a very real possibility you might end up as one of them. By the 1700s, the scale of suffering hadn't lessened. It only changed form. If you were to find yourself aboard a transatlantic slave ship during the Middle Passage, you'd be witnessing one of the most inhumane chapters in human history. Captives from West Africa were shackled below deck, sitting shoulder to shoulder on bare wooden planks with barely enough space between them to breathe. The air was thick with sweat, blood, waste, and vomit. So bad that crew members above sometimes fainted from the smell. People were force-fed, whipped, and made to jump in chains for exercise. Many died from disease, often while still chained to the living. Some tried to jump to their deaths to escape it all. Some revolted. Most didn't make it. Then came the Titanic. If your time machine drops you on board on the night of April 14th, 1912, well, don't get too comfortable. At 11:40 p.m., the so-called unsinkable ship hits an iceberg. Within 3 hours, over 1,500 people are dead. If you're in steerage, you'll feel a strange jolt, maybe hear some shouting. But no one really panics until freezing water starts creeping through the lower decks. There aren't enough lifeboats, and in the chaos, some are launched half empty. By 2:20 a.m., the stern is vertical, and if you're not already in a lifeboat, well, you're going into 28 degree Fahrenheit water. It's so cold that it paralyzes you in less than 10 minutes and knocks you unconscious within 15. Survivors said it felt like being stabbed by thousands of knives. In another corner of the world, the Congo Free State was being run like a private death camp by King Leopold II of Belgium. If you were an unprepared time tourist, you might assume you were just visiting a colony. In reality, it was a massive forced labor operation where entire villages were enslaved to meet rubber quotas. Fail to bring enough, and you'd be flogged with a whip made of sun-dried hippo hide, or have your hand chopped off as proof of punishment. That punishment became so routine that soldiers carried around baskets full of it to show they weren't wasting bullets. Those who resisted were shot, burned alive, or left to starve. 10 million people passed away. Around that time, the bubonic plague also made a vicious comeback. Let's just say you wanted to steer clear of Bombay. By 1896, the city was in full panic. What started in China's Yunnan province decades earlier had made its way across port cities and was now tearing through India like it was still the Middle Ages. Thousands fled. Those who stayed faced death by fever, bursting black buboes, or gangrene eating away at their fingers and faces. And since the slums were hit the hardest, British colonial authorities responded by torching homes, dragging suspected cases to segregation camps, and enforcing crackdowns that only made things worse. In the following decades, 12 million Indians lost their lives. Meanwhile, in 1916, soldiers on the Western Front were trapped in a different kind of nightmare. The Battle of the Somme became one of the deadliest in human history, and easily one of the worst places to time travel to. Life in the trenches meant knee-deep mud, freezing rain, and rats the size of cats feasting on corpses. The smell was constant, a mix of unburied bodies, open latrines, gangrene, and the chemical sting of chlorine gas. If disease didn't get you, machine gun fire probably would. And when that whistle blew, it meant climbing out of the trench and running into no man's land, straight towards the barbed wire and the bullets. Now, let's say your time machine glitches and drops you a year earlier. Different front, same war. But this isn't a battlefield. It's Eastern Anatolia in 1915, and the Ottoman Empire has just begun one of the deadliest campaigns of civilian extermination in modern history. Under the cover of World War I, Ottoman authorities accused the Armenian population of siding with enemy forces and used that as a pretext to wipe them out. If you show up in April 1915 in Constantinople, you'll see the first wave. Hundreds of Armenian leaders arrested and quietly executed. Travel east, and you'll witness mass deportations. Entire villages marched at gunpoint into the desert with no supplies and no way back. Men were pulled aside and killed. Women were assaulted or sold. Most died of starvation or were murdered before reaching any so-called resettlement. By the end, up to 1.2 million Armenians were gone. Fast forward to 1937, and I'm sorry to say, nothing will be able to prepare you for what was going on in Nanjing. When Japanese troops captured the city in December, they unleashed 6 weeks of slaughter that would become known as the Rape of Nanjing and the Nanjing Massacre. Up to 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war were murdered, often in full view of their loved ones. Families were executed together, including the elderly and even infants. Thousands of women were horribly abused. Even the so-called safety zone offered no protection. People were simply dragged out and executed on the spot. Survivors later said there was so much blood in the streets that it literally stained the Qinhuai River red. On the flip side, if Nanjing was blood in the streets, Stalingrad was blood frozen into the rubble. In the winter of 1942, the Soviet city was bombed into ruins, overrun with German and Soviet troops, and choked with starving civilians. In short, Stalingrad was turned into a cold, claustrophobic death trap. People fought over single rooms. The dead were left frozen where they fell, and often survival boiled down to a rat, sawdust soup, or worse. By the time the German army surrendered in January 1943, more than 1 million people were dead or dying. So, if your time machine lands you here, keep your head down, and don't expect to make it to spring. On a totally different note, spring in Rwanda looks beautiful, but you wouldn't want to be anywhere near it in 1994. For 100 days, the country's hills became an open-air slaughterhouse when Hutu extremists launched a campaign to wipe out the Tutsi minority. Roughly 800,000 people were killed in the most horrific ways imaginable. If you time travel here, you won't get very far. The roads were filled with roadblocks, and anyone marked Tutsi was murdered on the spot. Homes were raided, churches and schools became death traps as Tutsis tried to find safe places to hide, and the streets of Kigali were filled with the dead in a matter of days. Unless you're in hiding or off the grid entirely, you You are not walking out of this one. And even if you do, you'll never forget it. Which brings me to the original "Don't invade Russia during the winter" cautionary tale. If you find yourself among Napoleon's army in late 1812 during the retreat from Moscow, you'll be in a frozen wasteland where temperatures plunge to negative 30 degrees Celsius. With food gone and fires impossible in the blizzards, desperate men butcher their horses alive just to eat the flesh while it's still warm. And when the horses run out, well, I'm not even going to go there. Some men stumble forward on bloody stumps from frostbite. Others are killed for their boots or stripped of whatever clothing might keep someone else alive. And then there's the Berezina River. Collapsing bridges, ice-cold water, and thousands dying as Russian forces close in from behind. Yeah, unless you've always dreamed of freezing to death next to a half-eaten horse, you definitely want to skip this one. Pol Pot took it a step further, and he didn't need winter to starve people to death. His regime found reasons to kill everyone. Go to Cambodia in the late 70s and you'll find a country turned inside out. The Khmer Rouge had emptied the cities, forced millions into the countryside, and declared war on modern life itself. If you were educated, religious, wore glasses, spoke French, or just looked like you once lived in a city, that alone could get you killed. And if you weren't executed on sight, you starved, or died from disease, or collapsed from working 18-hour days on a handful of rice. By the time it was over, Cambodia had lost 1 in every 4 of its people. There is no good way to transition into Auschwitz. And maybe that's the point. If hell on earth has an address, this was it. Auschwitz, in Nazi-occupied Poland, was a machine built for genocide. Efficient, deliberate, and horrifyingly effective. Between 1940 and 1945, about 1.3 million people were sent here. Over 1 million never came back. Should you arrive here as a prisoner, your life expectancy is measured in weeks. New arrivals were separated, some to forced labor, the rest to gas chambers. Either way, most don't survive long. Inside the chambers, up to 2,000 people are crammed in at a time and poisoned. Their bodies are stripped, searched for gold teeth, and burned. Walk the camp, and you'll see the starving, the sick, and those dying slowly from exhaustion and cold. When Allied troops finally reached it in January 1945, only 7,000 survivors remained. Moving on, let's talk about the earthquake you'll never want to witness. In 1556, a magnitude 8 earthquake struck China's Shaanxi province and the surrounding regions, and killed an estimated 830,000 people. Yeah, almost 1 million people. It was the deadliest earthquake in recorded history. Whole mountains collapsed, rivers changed course, and densely packed towns disappeared in minutes. But what made it so lethal wasn't just the size of the quake, it was how the people in the area lived. You see, back then, millions of people lived in yaodongs, or cave dwellings that were carved into the sides of cliffs. When the earthquake hit, the cliffs themselves crumbled, and whole communities were buried alive. The destruction and loss of life were so widespread that some counties lost 60% of their population in a single day. And then there's what happened when the Mongols showed up in Baghdad. If you showed up on time, somewhere during February 1258, you might be arriving just as Hulagu Khan's army is preparing to take the city. The siege doesn't last long. In fact, it takes the Mongols only a few days, and from that point on, Baghdad barely stands a chance. What was once a center of science, literature, and culture quickly turns into something else entirely. The Caliph is executed. The libraries, including the legendary House of Wisdom, are destroyed. You might even see the river run black as the ink from priceless scrolls disappears into the water. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands died, maybe even 1 million, but no one really knows for sure. And number 2 on today's list, I think it's safe to say none of us want to be anywhere near the coast of northern Sumatra on Boxing Day 2004. It was the day after Christmas, and people across Southeast Asia were easing into the morning, eating breakfast, strolling along the beach, completely unaware that one of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded had just hit off the coast of Sumatra. There was no warning system. Just a lot of confusion as the sea pulled back in some places and surged forward in others. Within hours, the tsunami had struck Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, India, and more. By nightfall, over 230,000 people were dead. It all happened so fast that most people never stood a chance. Finally, there's the split second that changed the world forever. If you're in Hiroshima as a time traveler on August 6, 1945, there's nothing you can do and nowhere to go. As a matter of fact, I don't even think you'll have time to regret it. On that morning, people were walking to work, opening their shops and getting ready for another day in the city. At 8:15 a.m., the first atomic bomb ever used in war was detonated. In less than a second, tens of thousands of people were dead and whole neighborhoods were erased. Those further out were left to suffer the effects of radiation for the weeks, months, and years to come. By the end of 1945, 140,000 people were gone, most without ever knowing what hit them. And that's all I have for you today, thank goodness. Now this one was rough. I mean, even with a few moments of levity, it really didn't make time travel sound like much fun. I think the worst part is that we've barely scratched the surface. There are so many days in history you absolutely don't want to land on. And I'm already guessing some of you have a few in mind, so drop them in the comments. I'll be down there too. And if you need a break from all the historical ugliness, check out our related video, 25 Strangest Places in the World You Won't Believe Exist. It's still weird, but, in a way that won't ruin your week. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any new content, and I'll see you guys next time.